Hello and welcome back to another full step-by-step PC build guide, and today we're showing you how to build a PC in the Lian Li Cases A3. Now this is a micro ATX case. It comes in both black and white and has an MSRP of less than $70. So let's dive in and take a closer look. We've got mesh panels on the side, and to remove them you simply pull them out from the back and lift out. If you want to see into your build, there is an optional tempered glass panel you can get for the case, and it will set you back $12.99. And our other side panel is removed in exactly the same way. To remove our case's top panel, we've got two captive thumb screws at the back we need to loosen. Then we're going to be able to pull the panel backwards, lift up and away. Taking a look at our case's front I/O, we've got two USB Type A ports, a power button, a separate headphone and microphone jack, and a single Type C port. So while all the other panels are made from mesh, the front panel is actually solid and it can simply be pulled off from the front. We've got a magnetically attached dust filter on the bottom of the case, which can simply be pulled away for cleaning. On the side of the case, we've got a removable fan stroke radiator bracket. It's held on with two screws at the top. And once these have been loosened, you're going to be able to tilt the bracket out and lift away. So your micro ATX motherboard is going to be installed here. And if you want to go with a CPU cooler, the maximum height supported is 165mm. In terms of fan support, at the top, on the side and at the bottom, you're able to mount up to 3 120 or 2 140mm fans, while on the rear of the case it's up to a single 120mm fan. In terms of radiator support, on both the side and the top it's up to a 360 or 280mm radiator, while at the bottom it's up to a 240 or 280mm radiator. Now importantly, these are the maximum fan and radiator mounting options in each of these locations, but whether you can actually go up to those maximum will depend on how you mount your power supply, and importantly how you mount your power supply is also going to determine the graphics card support in this case, so we'll cover that later on. So while we've got a removable fan stroke radiator bracket on the side of the case, there's no removable bracket at the top. We've just got a few accessories to get out of the case. So at the bottom we've got our ATX offset bracket, and at the top of the case we've got our case accessory box. And you can see you're going to be able to keep all your case accessories neatly organised in their own individual compartments in the box. So moving on to the most complicated bit about this case, and that is actually the power supply support. And it is actually this which is going to limit how big a GPU and how much cooling support you have in each of those locations we've mentioned already. So in terms of power supply compatibility, the case is compatible with full-sized ATX power supplies up to a maximum length of 220mm, although Lian Li recommend if you are using a full-sized ATX power supply, you try and keep it less than 140mm, and they do actually recommend SFX or SFXL power supplies for this case. So out of the box, your power supply is going to be installed at the front, although there is an option to move this bracket onto the side of the case. And again, in each of these positions, there is different heights that you're going to be able to install your power supply in, and that is obviously going to influence your radiator and fan support as well as your GPU compatibility. To free up our power supply bracket, there's two screws at the top you're going to need to remove. And then to free the power supply bracket up, you're just simply going to lift it up, and then you're going to be able to remove it from the case. So if you've got an SFX power supply, you can insert it straight onto the bracket, line it up to the holes and secure it with four of the large power supply screws from the case accessory box. If you want to go with a full-sized ATX power supply, there's part of this bracket you're going to have to remove. It's held on with two screws. You can then slide your full-sized ATX power supply into the bracket and secure it into place with the four power supply screws. So in terms of mounting at the front of the case, there's 5 different height options. You can see we've got 5 holes here and 5 notches here for the bottom of the bracket to slide into. The bottom set of notches and holes is just for mounting the hard drive bracket at the front of the case, not your power supply bracket, and I'll show you that in a minute. So it's the top 4 that you're going to use in terms of height options for your power supply. The top one is if you've got a long ATX power supply. The second slot is if you want to mount fans above the power supply. The third slot down is for a slim AIO above the power supply, and for a standard AIO above the power supply, you're going to use the fourth one down. So to mount your bracket, all you want to do is slide it into place. If I'm going to go for the top one, I'm going to slide it all the way up and then lower it down. These notches are going to catch here, and then you can re-secure it with the screw. So that's what it looks like in the top position. If I want to move it down one, I can lower it down to here. So that's the second position where you're going to have room for fans above the power supply. Slide it down one more, and this is for a slim AIO above the power supply. And then if we go down to the fourth slot, you're going to be able to fit a standard AIO above the power supply. So if you look in from the side, you can see how moving the power supply into each of these different positions is going to influence the space that you have above the power supply, but also as the power supply moves its way further down, it's going to impact on where your GPU is going to be and limit your GPU length. So Lian Li do recommend going with an SFX or an SFXL power supply in this case, and I think there's a couple of reasons for it. The first is, even this is a pretty slim full-size ATX power supply, but you can see with an AIO above it, it is encroaching quite far down into where your GPU is going to go, and it's going to be significantly influencing that, and you're also going to have to factor in all the cables coming out the bottom as well. The other issue with full-sized ATX power supplies is they have much longer cables, and you're going to have much more cables to manage in the main body of the case, because there isn't really any option for routing your cables behind the motherboard tray. They're all going to be in the main body of the case. So another thing to consider with your power supply mounted at the front is this is going to limit what you can fit on the side fan and radiator mounting bracket. So you can see with our power supply installed at the front, it doesn't matter what position you install it in terms of height, or whether you've gone for an SFX or ATX power supply, it is going to influence what you put on this bracket. And it is possible to fit a 360 radiator or up to 320mm fans, but with your power supply mounted at the front, you are limited to up to a 280mm radiator or up to two 140mm fans. If you want to get the full compatibility on the side, you're going to need to move the power supply to the side of the case. So you might be wondering how to use this ATX offset bracket that you noticed I removed from the case earlier on. Well, what you're going to do is fix it to your ATX power supply first of all. You can then insert your power supply bracket over the power supply as normal, and then you can use 4 of the smaller screws to secure the standard power supply bracket to the offset bracket. And then if we slot our power supply into place in the second position down from the top, you'll see that although we've installed our power supply in the second position, because we have used the offset bracket, our power supply normally would be up here, but we've moved it down half a slot in terms of position, and it is in the front 2.5 position. So with a full-sized ATX power supply in the second position using the offset bracket, you now are able to fit 3 120mm fans above the power supply. If you don't use the offset bracket in the second position, the problem is you're only going to be able to fit 2 120 or 2 140mm fans. And the advantage of doing this is it's going to improve your GPU compatibility rather than going down all the way to the third slot. Now, Lian Li do have a very nice table up on their website. I'll put a link to it in the description. And it shows you in each of the positions what your GPU compatibility is going to be depending on which slot you've mounted your power supply in. So we've got a power supply extension cable which runs to the back of the case. We can plug it into your power supply and make sure you flip the power switch on your power supply. And if we take a look at the top of the case, you can see we've got some little clips here for managing our power supply extension cable running towards the back of the case. So one more option you have with an ATX power supply is to actually mount it on the SSD bracket. First step is to install these large standoffs. Next we can set our drive bracket into place and secure it with the large power supply screws. We can then slot the bracket into place at the front. And this is what your ATX power supply is going to look like installed at the front in this orientation. Cables are going to be coming out from the side, so they're not going to have cables coming out the bottom, which should improve your GPU compatibility. Downside is you're going to have to be pretty careful with these cables because they are going to be coming out where your motherboard is. As well as keeping your power supply cool, this looks to be a nice option because the power supply's intake fan is going to be right up against the mesh panel. And it does look like you still are going to be able to install SSDs on this bracket. They still fit in between the gap on the power supply, so you're still going to be able to occupy both slots, but you would obviously need to install your SSDs before putting your power supply onto the bracket. To install your power supply on the side of the case, you're going to need to remove this drive bracket. It's held on with 2 screws at the top, and then how you remove it is exactly the same as the power supply bracket. Simply lift it up and away. And you can see here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 positions you can mount your power supply in. So we'll just slot it into place in the top slot. And again, you're going to secure it the same way with the 2 screws. Okay, so we take a look in from the front. I'll show you what the power supply looks like in each of those 4 positions. So the big advantage you're going to have installing your power supply on the side is it now opens up the full width of that front fan stroke radiator bracket for an AIO, where you can mount up to a 360mm AIO or up to 3 120mm fans. Downside of it is, as your power supply works its way further down, it is going to influence your GPU position significantly. And you can see that the power supply is going to extend all this way, where it was at the front, it was only taking up this amount, and you're going to have much better GPU compatibility. You can see in this lowest position, it's not really going to influence what you can mount at the top of the case. But moving up to its top position, you can see it's going to significantly influence the mounting at the top. So really you just need to refer to that table that Lian Li have got to help you decide how you're going to best orientate your hardware. To install drives in the case, you're going to set these rubber pads over the holes in your drives, and then you can secure it with a drive screw, the thicker ones over the 3.5-inch drive and the thinner ones over the 2.5-inch drive. So in this drive bracket here, we're going to be able to mount up to 2 2.5-inch drives. Just a matter of lining up with the bracket, and then as we push down, the rubber pads are going to slot into place holding our drive. And as we mentioned, there is an option to install your power supply at the back. So if you do that, it is possible to move this drive bracket to the front of the case. Just a matter of lifting it up, and then we can move it to the front of the case and slot it into place. And again, you do have all the different height options similar to what you have with your power supply. It is also possible to mount a drive down at the bottom of the case. To get access to all the holes, we're going to need to remove this little plate where our GPU support bracket is going to sit. So it's just a matter of pushing this in, and then we're going to be able to lift it out. So to mount a 2.5-inch drive, it's exactly the same process as the other bracket. Slot it into place and push down, and that's going to hold it in place at the bottom of the case. And then it's a similar process for our 3.5-inch drive. We're just going to slot it into place, and again, push forward to lock it in place. So you can see at the rear of the case, we've got 4 horizontal PCI expansion slot brackets, and in terms of graphics card support, the maximum length supported is up to 415mm. But just remember, that's the maximum graphics card support, and it is going to be influenced by your power supply. So if your power supply is installed at the side, it's more likely to influence your graphics card and reduce it down. And if you've got it at the front, then the lower down you bring it, the more likely it is going to be to influence your graphics card support. So because you can install such large graphics cards, we've got a GPU support bracket included, and we've got this magnetic plate at the bottom to attach it to. So it simply slots onto this plate and attaches magnetically. And then what you're going to want to do is slide this up to where it's supporting your graphics card, and then you're going to tighten up the thumb screw to hold it in place. So if you want to keep your graphics card nice and cool, it is possible to mount fans beneath it. The important thing to remember that if you only use standard 25mm thick fans, your graphics card thickness has to be less than 61mm, and if it's thicker than that, you may need to use slim fans. So if you do fancy mounting your graphics card vertically, it is possible to do, but you are going to have to pick up the optional vertical GPU kit, which will set you back $49.99. So the first step in installing your vertical GPU bracket is to replace all the expansion slot covers with this bracket here. It has a rubber grommet in it, and your HDMI and DisplayPort cables are going to pass through here and go into the case to plug into the graphics card. So we can loosen this bracket up here. We can then slide the new bracket into place and secure it using the screws. And then we can close the cover again. We can then set the vertical GPU bracket into the case, and then it's going to be these 4 slots that you're going to secure it using. And you notice we've got 2 little screw holes in the bracket, so you can install it all the way towards the back or all the way towards the front, depending on where you want it orientated. So I'm going to try it all the way towards the back. And then the process of installing your graphics card is just like any other vertical GPU bracket. This bit is going to go into your motherboard. We can open the cover on our riser cable, and then we can slot our GPU into place. And then we can secure the graphics card into place with the power supply screws that came with the vertical GPU kit. And to prevent sag, we can use the GPU support bracket that came with our case. And you're going to be able to pass your HDMI or DisplayPort cables through this cutout. So you can see I'm not able to get this plugged in now because I've got my graphics card installed all the way towards the back of the case. So what you would need to have done is plugged your cables in before securing your graphics card to the bottom. So in terms of power supply compatibility, because this is such a large graphics card, we're not really going to be able to have a power supply at the front. I have installed it here, but it's pretty much resting down on top of the graphics card, and the graphics card is potentially going to prevent you plugging in some cables into your power supply. So putting your power supply at the front isn't going to be a good option with such a large graphics card. What about behind it? Okay, so that's the power supply installed all the way at the top, and that's all the way down at the bottom. So with an SFX power supply, there doesn't really seem to be any limitations behind the vertical GPU. And you can see here we're not going to have any problem getting an AIO installed all the way at the top above our power supply. So while this is definitely possible, I think there is 2 potential issues with it. The first is because the graphics card is so large with this particular one, it's going to be blocking our pump, so we're not going to actually see very much of our build apart from the graphics card. But I think the biggest issue with this is the point of mounting your graphics card vertically is that you can see it. And you might think, okay, there's a tempered glass panel I can put on the side. That's going to give me a great view of things. The problem is your graphics card is literally going to be a few millimeters away from that tempered glass panel. And for an air-cooled card like this, it will overheat in that position. So you've got absolutely endless possibilities when it comes to this case in terms of mounting your hardware. At the moment, I'm not even sure what sort of build I'm going to do. I'm going to go and have a think. But in the meantime, let's move on to start working with our motherboard. We're now ready to start working on our motherboard, and we're going to be installing the CPU, the backplate for our CPU cooler, our M.2 SSD and our RAM before we put the motherboard into the case. To open our socket cover, we need to push this lever down and out, bring it all the way to the top of the motherboard, and then we can open the socket cover up. We can then lower our CPU down into the socket. There's notches at the top and the bottom, which are going to line up. We give it a little wiggle from side to side to check it's properly seated, and then we can go ahead and close the socket cover down. If we apply a little bit of pressure here, the bit of plastic will pop off. We'll put it in the motherboard box for safekeeping, and then we can close the lever again to secure our CPU. Our M.2 SSD heatsink is held on with 2 screws. We're going to need to remove the screw from the standoff, and then we're going to be able to insert our M.2 SSD into the socket. We can flatten it down and secure it again with a screw. If you're using the motherboard from new, there'll be some plastic protection on the back of the heatsink that you're going to need to remove, and then we can replace the heatsink. We're going to be installing the RAM in the 2nd and 4th slot along from the CPU, so we'll open the clips on these slots. We can then line our RAM up with the slots. Once we're happy it's all lined up, just some firm pressure, and it's going to clip into place. We're ready to install the backplate for our CPU killer. We're going to want to make sure we use the one labeled 1700. There is some double-sided adhesive here, so if you want to use it, just remove the paper here to let it stick to the back of your motherboard. This is just a temporary build for me, so I'm not going to use it. And then we've got one of these standoffs to go into each corner. Before we insert the motherboard into the case, we need to install our I/O shield. We can then insert our motherboard into the case, lining it up with the standoffs at the back, and we'll secure it with 8 of the motherboard screws from the case accessory box. I've removed the motherboard because this standoff isn't coming through the hole actually. On our motherboard it's slightly down here we would want the standoff. So what I'm going to do is just remove this standoff and secure it with the other 7 screws. Next thing to do is get our case cables plugged in. Our HD audio cable is going to go into this header down the bottom left hand side of the motherboard. So we can go ahead and plug it in with the HD audio text facing up the way. And then I'm just going to tuck the cable in onto the motherboard. Our front panel connectors are going to go into this header here. So we're going to plug it in with the front panel text facing up the way. Working up the motherboard, our USB 3.0 cable is going to go here. So we'll plug it in. And just below that, we've got our front panel Type-C header. So again, we'll plug our cable in. Now, I often find in these small form factor builds it is easier to cable manage as you go. So we do have some cable tie down points here. So this brings us on to our power supply. So I've just left the SFX power supply installed in the bracket, and I plugged in a 24-pin cable. We have plugged in a single 8-pin EPS cable to provide additional power to your CPU, and a 12-volt high power cable to power our graphics card. So I've already sized things up before doing the build, and it's the 4th slot down that we're going to want to install our power supply in. Then we want to get our power supply cables plugged in, so I'm going to plug our 24-pin cable into here, and our 8-pin EPS cable is going to go to here. So you can see the only downside of using an SFX power supply, the cables are actually a little bit short for this case, so they are a little bit tight stretching over the top of our RAM, but I think they'll do okay for this build. We can then plug the extension cable into the top of our power supply. We're going to want to make sure we turn the switch on the power supply to on. Next, we can set our fans onto the radiator and secure them into place using the long radiator screws. Then we just need to daisy chain the fans together, so the PWM cable will push in together, and we can remove this protective cover from the ARGB cable and join our ARGB cables together. So these cables may actually be long enough to reach the top of our motherboard, so I'm not going to plug the extension cables in yet, but we do get an extension cable for both PWM and ARGB if there's a longer cable run to do. We just need to install the Intel bracket onto our pump, so it's just a matter of lining it up and then pushing into place. We can then set our I/O into the case. Now I'm struggling to get that in, so what I'm going to do is temporarily lower our power supply down to the bottom to get the I/O in, and then we'll slide the I/O into place. So I'm just spotting another potential problem. Once we install our I/O at the top, plugging in our ARGB and also our CPU fan head cables is going to be really difficult. So I'm going to plug those extension cables in first and then put the I/O up the top. So I have managed to get the I/O set into place, but you can see it is actually pushing the ARGB and PWM cables down. So this is not going to be an option to install these cables at the top. So what I'm going to have to do is remove these cables, and we'll have to plug them into other fan and ARGB headers elsewhere on the motherboard. And at this point we can slide our power supply back up into place. We can add some thermal paste to the center of the CPU. If you're using the CPU cooler from new, make sure you remove the plastic protection from the cold plate. And then we just need to slide the pump over the bracket on the motherboard. And then we just need to get a thumb screw onto each corner. Because we can't reach the CPU ops header at the top of the motherboard, I'm just going to plug the cable coming from our pump into a system fan header down at the bottom of the motherboard. And then we've got the PWM cable coming from the fans and the radiator, and I'm just going to plug it into our CPU fan header at the top of the motherboard. In terms of getting our ARGB plugged in, there's actually no way to reach the headers at the top of the motherboard, and I've actually had to look around the bottom, and our only two ARGB headers are at the very top right of this motherboard where the radiator is blocking them. So what I can do is add in an ARGB controller. So all I'm going to do is daisy chain the ARGB cable coming from our fans into the ARGB cable coming from our pump, and then I'm going to plug this into our ARGB controller. It just has a little button on it and you can press it to cycle through the effects, and we'll hide that down the bottom of the case. The only additional thing I'm going to have to do is plug in a SATA power cable to power this. Okay, so that's the SATA power cable plugged into our power supply, and then we'll plug the cable into our controller. And we'll just tuck everything in down at the bottom. Now the other thing that's driving me absolutely nuts is this EPS cable stretching across the top. It's just too short, so I am going to use an extension cable. So we'll go ahead and unplug it from the motherboard. We can plug it into the extension cable, and then we'll plug the extension cable back into the motherboard. And then we should be able to route this nicely over the top. I'm just going to set a 120mm fan into place at the rear of the case, and I'm actually installing it the wrong way round, so it's set to intake, and that way it'll be bringing plenty of fresh air in directly into your CPU cooler. And then we can install it using the included fan screws. And if we take a look down at the bottom of the case, we've got another system fan header here, so we'll go ahead and get the fan plugged in. So once we install our graphics card, we're not going to be able to manage all our cables, so I'm going to go ahead and manage them at this stage. We're now ready to install our graphics card, so we can open the clip in the top PCIe slot. We can then slide our graphics card into place, and once we're happy everything's lined up, it's just some firm pressure, and it's going to clip into place. And we can secure it using the two screws at the side. And then we can close the door on the side. And then we can get our GPU cable plugged in. And I'm just going to tuck the cable down in front of the graphics card. And then we can replace the panels. Okay, so that's the build complete. If you don't know how to set up the PC, I've made another video that covers all of that. What I'm planning on doing now is some thermal testing, and then I'm going to be back with a case review. So you want to hear what I think about the case, you're going to want to check out that video, and I'll put a link to it in the description. If you have enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up, and if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.